Hi everyone, my name is Thomas Miskivens, and today I'm going to be talking to you about systems thinking, and specifically its application to learning and development. So for those of you who aren't familiar with systems thinking, I'll be going over some of the main points as we hit them, so hopefully it won't be a terribly confusing introduction to the subject. Systems have three components, which are elements, interconnections, and a purpose. Elements are the actual components of a system. Interconnections are the relationships between the elements, and the purpose, like it sounds, is the overall goal or purpose for the system's existence. As you may know, lasting change is made working with the interconnections and the purpose of a system rather than swapping out its elements. There are a vast amount of elements in a standard learning and development system if we want to get technical, but I've made a list of the major ones here, and they are management, the learning and development team, subject matter experts, employees, instructors, and of course the content itself. The interconnections between these elements form a mass web of relationships, from the learning and development team working with subject matter experts and employees in developing courses, to management hiring instructors who then relay the content to the employees. These likely vary between different companies and industries, and these obviously aren't all of the relationships in the system, but hopefully this helps you understand how interconnections play out in learning and development. The purpose of the learning and development system, as I see it, is to increase job-related knowledge and skills over time, but only to a certain extent. As you can see, I've put caps on the top and bottom of this graph of job-related knowledge, which is relative to the application of this knowledge, and this means performance reviews or subject tests. The numbers on the side of this graph are arbitrary, but they could indicate performance ratings or tests of the employee's knowledge and skills after the trainings. Going back to the red dashed lines indicating the limits to growth, the bottom boundary indicates that learning and development initiatives are meant to keep knowledge above a certain point and keep it increasing over time. The top boundary indicates that these initiatives are not to exceed a certain growth rate. While this might sound counterintuitive or even wrong, the behavior of the system makes this apparent in a couple of ways. First, many development courses have limited availability. They might only be offered once or twice a year. Second, many organizations don't see incredibly rapid development or promotions, and if they do, they don't chalk it up to the learning and development efforts. So that's the reason for the upper boundary that I put on the graph. So now we're going to talk about the stocks and flows of the learning and development system. The stock of a system is the measurable part of the system. This could be the amount of water in a bathtub or the temperature in a room. For this system, we're going to use job-related knowledge and skills, which are measured in a number of different ways. There are also inflows, which fill our stock. These might be learning and development efforts, annual trainings, orientation trainings, which establish a base level of our stock, outside information from conferences or other courses, or even the employee's desire to learn. So, increasing any of these inflows will increase our level of stock, meaning increasing learning and development efforts, annual trainings, the amount of orientation training, all of that is going to increase our job-related knowledge and skills. Now, outflows decrease our stock. Examples of these might be the loss of knowledge over time, or the amount of activities performed in which the knowledge is not used. So again, if we perform more activities in which the knowledge that we've gained is not used, the rate in which our job-related knowledge and skills decreases is going to increase. So we're going to lose some of our job-related knowledge and skills. And the steady increase of this stock over time, like we saw on the graph of the system's purpose, comes from having a larger flow into the system than the flow out of the system. Now, the mechanisms that dictate the flow into and out of a stock are called feedback loops. The traditional learning and development system operates on balancing feedback loops, which seek to maintain the status quo of the system. The first feedback loop senses when there is a discrepancy between the desired knowledge and skills and the actual knowledge and skills, and adjusts the inflow accordingly. An example of this would be increasing learning and development efforts when performance or knowledge drops. Our second feedback loop controls the outflow from the stock. This senses discrepancies between the knowledge gained and the knowledge used, and of course we end up forgetting the knowledge that we don't use. Another feedback loop, which I believe is often ignored, deals with the inflow of the employee's desire to learn, and this is a reinforcing feedback loop. This means that it causes continual growth as long as it isn't restrained by a balancing feedback loop. So, in this reinforcing loop, the acquisition of job-related knowledge and skills produces an increase in performance, which leads to a reward. And this could either be a promotion or a raise, or even an intrinsic reward. And finally, this results in a greater drive to gain more knowledge and skills. So this is an ever-growing self-reinforcing feedback loop. This would have an incredible positive effect on the system if not for the overpowering strength of the balancing feedback loop, which dictates that development opportunities should only be made available if they are needed. Now, it's important to note here that these stock and flow diagrams are only models of the system, and by nature, they are incomplete in their information. So please don't treat these as 100% accurate guides for behavior in the system, but rather a general outline of the main processes within it. From what I can see, there are a few areas in this system that are open to constructive intervention. The first of these are the rules of the system. Like I said before, the balancing feedback loop doesn't have to dictate the availability of learning and development initiatives. We can change the rules and have them available at any time to anyone. We can convert annual development efforts to year-round development opportunities. The second intervention point is the reinforcing feedback loop. Instead of stunting this with a balancing feedback loop that limits the availability of development initiatives, let this run its course. Let the employee's own drive for advancement set the rules for their development. Shift the accountability for knowledge and skills to the employees. If they don't want to advance, they don't have to. But if they're driven, they have only their own limits stopping them. Finally, we can intervene with self-organization, and I believe this system has a massive potential to become self-organizing. So instead of prescribing development, have a development system created by the employees for the employees. Be proponents of knowledge sharing. Be proponents of communities of practice, of employee-led courses and development groups. By forcing the system to become self-organized around a reinforcing feedback loop, we find ourselves with a much more resilient and stable system than we had previously. This also helps us get rid of the upper limit that we saw on the purpose graph for our system, and it fosters development at the edge of possibility. Now, along with the advantage of continual unbridled growth that comes with these interventions, I would like to talk about the increase in stability that arises in the self-organizing system. For this, we can use an example. In traditional learning and development, a disruption to the system would result in a huge decrease in flow to the stock. An example of this might be the online learning system ceasing to function or instructors quitting. In these situations, there's no way to replace the elements in time to continue learning on schedule. However, in a self-organizing system, these disruptions would have little impact. After a disruption, the system would merely find a new way to distribute knowledge. Going back to the structure of systems, if you recall, I mentioned that lasting change comes from changing the interconnections and purpose of a system, rather than its elements. In the interventions I have suggested, you can see that we haven't changed any of the staff in the system or the content itself. Instead, we've altered the relationship that an organization has with learning and development. In doing this, we've also changed the purpose of the learning and development system. Previously, one might say that the purpose of this system was growth within limits, but utilizing self-organization and a reinforcing feedback loop, we can design a system with the purpose of growth beyond limits. So instead of having a limiting purpose, we now have an ever-growing, ever-expanding purpose. So why does systems thinking work so well for these kinds of problems? Systems thinking forces us to break down the frame of reference of the system we've designed, and it also forces us to acknowledge the possibilities in the system that we aren't utilizing, and this changes our frame of reference. We saw this in the breakdown of the balancing feedback loop that currently holds the system in check, and the reinforcing feedback loop that isn't being utilized. We were able to think critically about the advantages and disadvantages of working with our current model, which was 2 balancing feedback loops. This was effective in creating stable growth within certain limits, but it doesn't utilize the full potential of the system. Once we discovered the reinforcing feedback loop, we were able to play around with what a self-organizing, ever-growing system might look like. This caused us to step out of our current reality, one in which development needs to be controlled, and into a different reality where development can control itself. Another reason this works so well is that the interventions based on systems thinking use parts of the system that already exist, which allows for large changes without a lot of effort. So basically we're using the system to its own advantage. That's all I have for today, and if you want to know more about systems thinking, please check out the Donella Meadows Institute. I put the link in the description. Thank you for listening.